Welcome all viewers to our channel. We are glad to see you here, where we share amazing stories from people's lives. Each of you is important to us, and we will be interested to know what country and city you are from. Please write about it in the comments. Now let's move on to our first story, 1946. The summer sun was rising over the red clay of the southern roads, coloring the horizon with golden hues. The small house on the outskirts of Montgomery, built of old-growth wood, had long been a place of life. 5 children, 2 parents, and a dog named Charlie shared this modest dwelling. The house was dilapidated, the roof leaked, and the walls breathed cold in the winter and hot in the summer. But inside there was a warm, loving atmosphere. Allison Brooks was the oldest of 5 children. Her mornings began with chores, helping her mother wash the younger ones, heating up cornbread for breakfast, and getting everyone ready for school. She was only 10 years old, but she already realized that she had a lot of responsibility on her shoulders. "Allison, don't forget your textbooks, and watch Tommy," Ruth, her mother, shouted across the small kitchen, where a charcoal fire burned sluggishly. Ruth worked as a seamstress, spending long hours at the sewing machine to earn some money. Allison's father, Harold, was a mechanic respected in the neighborhood for his honesty and hard work, but even he made barely more than enough to eat. One of those days, Allison learned for the first time that her skin was not just her color, but a stigma in some people's eyes. She was 10 when she and her mother and younger brothers first rode the bus downtown to sell her mother's sewing products. As they entered the bus, they walked to the back, to a long wooden bench specifically reserved for black people. Allison turned around and noticed a sign that read, "Whites Only." She couldn't understand why people were segregated, even on transportation. "Mom, why can't we sit in the front? It's free there," she asked, pointing to the empty seats. Ruth paused for a moment, sighing heavily. "Because that's what the law says, honey. But it's wrong, and one day it will be different." "You'll see," she said, squeezing her daughter's hand. Later at home, Allison shared this with her father. He sat next to her on the porch, where they often talked in the evenings. Harold was silent for a long time, then said, "People judge others by what they see on the outside, but real dignity is on the inside. Don't ever forget, Allison, you're as good as they are. And your skin is not a flaw. It's a strength, because it tells the story of your ancestors who went through hell and survived." The school years were a time of first discoveries, both good and bad, for Allison. She found friends and support in a dilapidated black school. The teachers tried to give the children the best they could, often buying supplies at their own expense. But every time Allison walked past the spacious, shiny school for white children, she felt bitter. One day on her way home from school, Allison saw 3 white boys yelling at her little brother Tommy, throwing dirt at him. Her heart sank, but instead of fear, she felt anger. "Hey, leave him alone," she shouted, running up to her brother. The boys laughed but stepped back. Allison hugged her brother and whispered, "Don't ever let them think you're weak." Evenings were family gatherings in their home. Harold often told the children about his parents, who had worked in the cotton fields but never gave up. He explained that their story was not only about slavery and suffering, but also about the resilience that had been passed on to them. Ruth taught Allison to sew, saying, "We may not have much, but we can create, and that's our strength." These lessons helped Allison not only survive segregation, but also dream of a future where she could change the world. When Allison was 12, she first heard about the protests against segregation. Her father had read in the newspaper about the struggle led by a young preacher named Martin Luther King. "One day," he told his daughter, "we will be part of this movement too." These words inspired Allison. She began helping her mother create flags and posters for local meetings to discuss how to fight for her rights. This was her first step into a life of fighting for justice. By the age of 14, Allison realized she wanted to be a teacher. She saw how education helped her teachers lead children to a brighter future and dreamed of giving that knowledge to the next generation. Despite her poverty, she believed she could achieve her goal. By the age of 18, Allison Brooks had graduated from a black high school in Alabama with honors. Her teachers said she could have succeeded at any university, but the path to higher education was closed because of poverty and racial discrimination. Allison decided it was her duty not just to tolerate injustice, but to fight it. 1964 was a year of change in her life. At that time, the civil rights movement was gaining momentum, and the names of leaders like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. were on everyone's lips. Allison felt it was her time to act. One Sunday evening, residents gathered at a local church to hear activists from Birmingham speak. They talked about the upcoming protests, the marches, and the importance of every voice. Allison listened, holding her breath. One of the activists, a tall man named Raymond, said, "Each of us can change the world. If we remain silent, injustice will win. But if we speak up, even the smallest voice becomes part of a powerful chorus." Those words lit a fire in Allison. She approached Raymond after the meeting and asked, "What can I do to help?" He smiled. "You have courage. That's all it takes." Allison started small. She helped organize meetings, hand out flyers, and make posters with slogans such as "Equal Rights for All" and "Stop Segregation." One day when she was putting up flyers on the street, a white man came up to her and ripped the poster off a nearby pole. "That's illegal, girl," he growled. Allison looked him in the eye, feeling fear but not showing it. "It's illegal the way you're treating us," she said firmly, and without waiting for an answer, she continued her work. This incident strengthened her resolve. In 1965, Allison joined one of the most significant events in the history of the civil rights movement, the March from Selma to Montgomery. It was a protest against the disenfranchisement of blacks. The day began in the morning fog. More than 600 people, including Allison, gathered at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, ready to walk 87 kilometers. People held placards and sang hymns, their voices coalescing into one, "We shall overcome." Allison walked alongside Raymond, who told her of his dream. "Someday I want to see my kids voting, sitting in school classrooms with white kids. That's worth fighting for." But the march encountered violence. They were met on the bridge by police and local volunteers armed with batons and tear gas. "Disperse! This is an illegal assembly," shouted the police. When the demonstrators refused to leave, the attack began. Allison remembers someone nearby screaming when the baton hit him in the head. She herself was knocked to the ground and felt a sharp pain pierce her shoulder. But fear gave way to anger. She saw people around her falling, but they kept singing and holding hands. Allison rose to her feet, her face wet with tear gas, but she shouted, "We will not stop." After the march, Allison spent the night in the hospital where she was treated for bruises and burns. There she met Clara Jenkins, an elderly woman who, despite being in her 70s, had participated in the march. "Why did you go there?" Allison asked. Clara smiled. "Because my mother was a slave, and I want to live to see the day when my grandchildren are free. If we don't fight, who will?" Those words stayed with Allison forever. Not everything about the struggle came easy. A few months after the march, Allison learned that Raymond had been shot and killed during a peaceful protest. The news came as a blow to her. She cried at night, sitting on the porch of the house where they had once discussed plans for the future. Her mother sat next to her and said, "He died doing what he loved. Don't let that break you. He would have wanted you to keep going." Those words helped Allison deal with the pain. She decided that she would fight even harder so that Raymond's and the others' sacrifices would not be in vain. Allison realized that inequality starts with ignorance. She organized clubs in her neighborhood to teach adults to read and write so they could register to vote. Her home became a center of activism where meetings were held, marches were prepared, and strategies were discussed. Allison realized that her personal pain was her weapon. She told people, "We've all lost someone. We're all tired of being afraid. But if we stand together, no one can stop us." 1966 was a year of new challenges and unexpected gifts for Allison Brooks. She was at an activist meeting in Birmingham, where they were discussing organizing another march. The room was filled with voices arguing about strategy and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Allison had just finished speaking when a young man with a broad smile and a look of genuine interest approached her. "You speak so confidently," he began. "You almost make me believe we'll win tomorrow." She smiled back. "Don't you believe it?" "I do," he replied, "but I think it takes people like you to do that. My name is George Brooks, by the way." He held out his hand and she shook it. That was how their acquaintance began. George was a mechanic like her father, but dreamed of opening his own auto shop. He liked solving problems and fixing things that others thought were hopeless. But what attracted him most was the way Allison talked about the future. They spent the entire evening discussing not only the civil rights movement, but also their dreams. She wanted to be a teacher, and he wanted to be an entrepreneur. Their relationship developed slowly but surely. Their first date was at a local fair, where George won a teddy bear for Allison in a game of marksmanship. "You have a marksmanship for words as well as shooting, Ms. Brooks," he joked. Allison laughed. She didn't think she could laugh at times like this, but George had a way of finding light even in the dark. Their evenings were filled with talk of the future, of how they would like to raise their children in a world where they would not be judged by the color of their skin. George used to say, "Dreams mean nothing without action. You are fighting to change the world, and I want to create something of my own in this world so that our children will know that their father never gave up." In 1967, after 2 years of dating, they were married. The wedding was modest, but full of love. Her parents organized a small dinner to which they invited only the closest friends and family. "Are you sure you're ready to be an activist wife?" Allison joked at the ceremony. "Only if you're willing to be the wife of a mechanic who's going to build a workshop," George replied. They both knew there were challenges ahead, but believed that love would help them overcome everything. A year after their wedding, they had their first child, a boy they named Michael. Allison remembers holding him in her arms for the first time in a small hospital room, feeling both joy and fear. She knew it would be difficult to raise a child in a world full of injustice, but she was willing to do anything to protect him. "Michael will be part of a new generation," she told George, "a generation that would change everything." After another 3 years, they had twin girls, Anna and Susan. Life with 3 children proved to be chaotic but full of love. George worked long hours in his workshop, which by then had become successful, and Allison continued her work in the civil rights movement. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. One day, when George was coming home from work, he was stopped by the police. They accused him of stealing, even though he was just taking home tools. Allison was furious, but George said, "This is exactly what we're fighting against. I'm not going to let it break us." Despite the challenges, their home became a place of harmony. Allison taught the children to read at an early age and often told them stories about those who fought for their rights. "Never be afraid to stand up for the truth," she told them. "Your family is your strength." George, in turn, taught them how to repair things, showing them how even the most difficult problems could be solved with patience and labor. "If something is broken, it doesn't mean it needs to be thrown away. It means it needs to be fixed," he said. George and Allison became a real team. When Allison went to marches or meetings, George stayed home with the children, cooking dinner and helping with homework. When he faced difficulties in the workshop, Allison always supported him, reminding him that his work was as important as hers. One day, after a particularly hard day, George said, "Sometimes I think we'll never see change." Allison took his hand. "We see them already, George. Our children are already changes. Our marriages change. Everything we do matters." Their dreams for the future always remained shared. They wanted to buy a big house with a garden where their children could play outdoors. They dreamed of a university for their children so that they could become whoever they wanted to be. But most of all, they dreamed of a world where their family could live without fear. This chapter ends with a scene where Allison and George are sitting on the porch of their house, watching their children play in the yard. George takes her hand and says, "You know, despite everything that's going on, I'm happy, because we have something worth fighting for." Allison smiles and replies, "And I'm happy because we're doing this together." Their love story wasn't just romantic. It was a force that helped them confront a world full of injustice and build a better future. Raising 3 children in a world where racism was part of the system proved to be a major challenge for Allison Brooks. She realized from the beginning that their education would be one of the main fronts of her struggle. When Michael went to first grade, she encountered her first example of injustice. "Your son is very active," the teacher said at the parents' meeting. "Maybe you should think about moving him to a special class." Allison tensed when she heard the familiar tone. She knew that those words often hid a desire to get rid of black students. Michael is doing an excellent job, she said, remaining calm. If you have specific comments, I'm willing to discuss them, but I won't tolerate prejudice against his skin color. After that conversation, the teacher became more attentive to Michael, but Allison realized she had many more battles like that ahead of her. Anna and Susan experienced other injustices. One day, when the girls brought home their test results, Allison noticed that their answers were marked as wrong, even though they were actually correct. She went to the school to talk to the teacher. I reviewed my daughter's tests, Allison said, holding the papers in her hands. Why were their correct answers crossed out? The teacher, nervously excusing himself, said it was a mistake, but Allison didn't believe it. She knew the system had been trying to suppress them since they were children. My children will learn here, she said firmly, and I will watch every step of the way. Allison has also experienced racism in her professional life. She worked at a community center, helping to organize educational programs for children from low-income families. However, her superiors, mostly white males, often questioned her decisions and abilities. Once, when she proposed a new financial literacy project, her boss rejected the idea, saying, "It's too ambitious. These kids can barely read, let alone understand finance." Allison held back her anger. "If you don't believe in these children, then why do you work here?" she said. The project did get off the ground after much negotiation, and its success was proof that she was right. Racism also haunted her in the most mundane situations. At the store, she was suspected of shoplifting if she stayed too long in the department. In the parking lot, she saw white people hide their wallets as she passed by, but the worst part was seeing her children confronted. One day, when Michael came home depressed, Allison asked what was wrong. "At school, a boy said I was dirty because of my skin color," he admitted. Allison felt anger boiling inside her, but she sat down next to her son and took his hand. "Michael, remember, your skin color is your dignity. Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise." Despite the constant struggle, Allison taught her children to be not only strong, but also kind. "Never reciprocate hate with hate," she told them. "That's what they want. We are stronger when we maintain our dignity. We're going forward despite everything," she told George. This chapter ends with a scene of Allison and George sitting in the kitchen discussing plans for the future. "Someday our children will live in a world where they don't have to fight for their rights," Allison said. George nodded. "And if they have to, they'll be ready. You teach them that every day." Allison smiled, realizing that her job is not only to change society, but to raise up a new generation of leaders who will continue her fight. The day began with a disturbing phone call. The phone rang early in the morning as Allison was making breakfast. Her daughter Anna was on the line. "Mom, Michael had another seizure." Her daughter's voice shook. "They took him to the hospital in Birmingham." Allison felt her heart sink. Michael, her oldest grandson, had suffered from asthma since childhood. Each attack was an ordeal for the whole family. "I'm checking out right now," Allison replied, glancing at her watch. She knew the journey would take several hours, and she needed to make it before nightfall. She organized family nights where they discussed books about the civil rights struggle, such as Malcolm X's autobiography and Martin Luther King's speeches. Each child shared his or her thoughts, and these discussions became their little tradition. George was always supportive of Allison. When she came home after a hard day, he was there to listen. Once, when Allison was talking about how she was being ignored at work again, he said, "You do more than they can understand. You're changing people's lives, Allie. Remember that." Those words reminded her that her struggle was not in vain. Each small victory gave her strength. When Anna won the school recitation contest and Michael became captain of the soccer team, Allison felt that their efforts were paying off. "We're going forward despite everything," she told George. This chapter ends with a scene of Allison and George sitting in the kitchen discussing plans for the future. "Someday our children will live in a world where they don't have to fight for their rights," Allison said. George nodded. "And if they have to, they'll be ready. You teach them that every day." Allison smiled, realizing that her job is not only to change society, but to raise up a new generation of leaders who will continue her fight. The day began with a disturbing phone call. The phone rang early in the morning as Allison was making breakfast. Her daughter Anna was on the line. "Mom, Michael had another seizure." Her daughter's voice shook. They took him to the hospital in Birmingham. Allison felt her heart sink. Michael, her oldest grandson, had suffered from asthma since childhood. Each attack was an ordeal for the whole family. I'm checking out right now, Allison replied, glancing at her watch. She knew the journey would take several hours, and she needed to make it before nightfall. Allison tried not to panic as she packed for the trip. She packed her bag carefully, taking only the essentials. Her hands were shaking a little, but she tried to stay calm. It's going to be okay, she repeated to herself. She left the house and got behind the wheel of her old Chevrolet. The car, though dilapidated, had always been reliable. She drove off, feeling the slight unease that had been lingering since the phone call. The road to Birmingham was familiar to Allison, but it still gave her mixed feelings. These highways, like their cities, held too many stories, both good and bad. She remembered traveling these roads to protest marches as a young girl. Back then, fear of the police wasn't just an instinct, it was a reality. Encounters with the police had always left scars in her soul. Her gaze fell to the rearview mirror, where the image of a patrol car flashed. Allison gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. Nothing has changed, she thought. They still see us as a threat, even if we're just going to the hospital. Her attitude toward police officers had been shaped by years of injustice. Allison couldn't forget how her husband George had once been stopped for no reason and searched on the side of the road. He came home with a torn shirt and the words, "They don't need reasons, Allie. It's enough that we just exist." She had seen police officers humiliate her friends and even her children. This distrust was passed on to her children. One day when Michael was still a little boy, he asked, "Grandma, why don't they like us?" Allison replied, "Not all of them are like that, Michael, but too many have forgotten that their job is to protect, not oppress." Halfway down the road, Allison noticed that she was running low on fuel. She stopped at a gas station to fill the tank. Once she had refueled, she got back on the road and continued on her way. Suddenly, a police car with its blinkers on appeared behind her. Allison's heart sank. "For what?" she whispered, slowing down and pulling over to the curb. A policeman got out of the car, a tall man with a stern expression. He walked over to Allison's window, tapping on the glass. "Good afternoon. ID and license, please," he said coldly. Allison quickly handed him the papers, trying not to make any sudden movements. She noticed his eyes studying her car. "Do you know why I stopped you?" he asked. "No, sir," Allison replied, trying to remain calm. The policeman frowned. "You weren't watching your lane. Perhaps you were tired or under the influence of something?" The words were like a slap in the face. Allison felt anger boiling up inside her. "I'm just going to the hospital to visit my grandson, sir," she said. "Can you prove it?" he asked, his tone growing more and more threatening. The policeman made her get out of the car. Allison could feel his intense gaze on her, more suspicion than professionalism. "Do you have anything illegal in your car?" he asked. "Of course not," she replied. But that didn't stop him. The policeman began to search her car. Allison stood on the curb, feeling helplessness overwhelm her. Every passing car seemed to give her a judgmental look. "Why should I have to prove my innocence?" she thought. When the search yielded nothing, the policeman returned to Allison. "You're free to go this time, but be careful." "Are you free?" she asked, looking him in the eye. "You just wasted my time, humiliated me, and all for no reason." His gaze grew even colder. "You'd better be on your way, madam, before I find a real reason to detain you." Allison walked back to the car, feeling her hands shaking with anger and humiliation. The rest of the drive was hard. Allison tried to concentrate on the upcoming meeting with her grandson, but her thoughts kept returning to the incident. Her eyes darted back and forth between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. "They haven't changed," she whispered. "I don't think they will." But despite her fear and fatigue, she wasn't going to give up. Her grandson was waiting for her at the hospital, and that was what mattered most. When Allison finally reached Birmingham, the sun was already setting. When she entered the room, she saw Michael lying on the bed with an oxygen mask on his face. Anna, her daughter, was sitting next to him, holding his hand. "Mom, you've arrived," Anna said with relief. Allison walked over to her grandson, put her hand on his forehead and whispered softly, "Grandma is with you, my boy. Everything is going to be all right." Despite the events of the day, She felt that her efforts had not been in vain. She was where she was supposed to be, with her family by her side. That trip reminded Allison that injustice was still alive, but her family was her strength. Sitting next to her grandson, she made a promise to herself. I will fight until my children and grandchildren can breathe easier in this world. This road was a reminder to her that the struggle never stops, but love and determination can endure any challenge. The sun was slowly sinking as Allison drove down the winding highway toward Birmingham. The road was deserted, with only the occasional car. In the rearview mirror, she saw the police car that had been following her for several minutes. Her heart quickened its rhythm. She tried to focus on the road, but the familiar feeling of unease wouldn't let go. Allison knew that in her life, a simple stop by a police officer was rarely just a formality. When the flashers came on and the siren broke the silence, Allison felt a cold sweat roll down her back. She took a deep breath and pulled over to the curb. It's going to be okay, she whispered to herself. The policeman got out of the car, a tall figure with a tense posture. His dark glasses hid his eyes, but his expression was hard. Allison watched him through the side mirror, trying not to make any sudden movements. Roll down the glass, he said sharply. She obeyed, feeling the air in the car feel like it was getting heavier. Good afternoon, sir, she began calmly. Paperwork, license, and registration, he cut her short. Allison handed him the necessary papers, watching him study them with obvious suspicion. Do you know why I stopped you? He asked, returning his gaze to her. No, sir, she replied, keeping her tone calm. You were zigzagging. You may be under the influence of alcohol or drugs, he said. Those words were like a blow. Allison felt her chest tighten with indignation. She'd never drank or used drugs in her life. Sir, I'm going to the hospital to visit my grandson. You can check my trunk if you want, she said. His eyes narrowed. Get out of the car. Barely had Allison opened the door when she noticed the policeman had his hand on his gun holster. Slowly, he shouted. She froze. Her heart was racing, fear for her life enveloping her. But she knew panic could cost her her life. I'm just coming out, sir, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The policeman drew his gun and pointed it at her. Allison froze, trying not to look directly at the muzzle, but she could feel his icy stare. Raise your hands. His voice was harsh, devoid of emotion. She obeyed, slowly raising her hands in the air. The wind lightly ruffled her clothes, but her whole body felt tense. Why are you threatening me with a gun? I didn't do anything, she asked calmly, though a hurricane was raging inside. Silence! He cut him off. The policeman stepped closer, forcing her to turn away and press her hands against the hood of the car. Do you have any weapons? Drugs? He asked, searching her. No, sir, she replied, feeling a humiliation she hadn't felt in a long time. Cars passed by, but no one stopped. Allison knew that to many people she was just a dark figure in the blinking lights. The policeman started going through her car. Every door, every drawer was open. He threw her bag on the ground, turning over its contents. There's nothing here, he finally said, looking at Allison suspiciously. She turned to him, finally deciding to speak. That's because I haven't done anything, but you only see my skin color and you think that's enough. The policeman frowned, his tone hardening. Watch your language, ma'am. Despite the humiliation, Allison kept her composure. Her voice was firm but calm. She knew that anger could only make things worse. I'm a grown woman, a mother of 3 and a grandmother, she said, looking him straight in the eye. And I'm tired of having to make excuses just for existing. The policeman took a step back, holstering his weapon. Her words seemed to have gotten through, but he didn't say anything back. You're free to go, he tossed, turning back to his car. Allison stood on the curb for a few more seconds before the policeman drove away. When she got back in the car, her hands were still shaking. She closed her eyes, trying to calm her breathing. I'm still alive, she whispered to herself. Her body felt heavy, as if she had just endured an entire battle. Allison drove the rest of the way in silence, pondering what had happened. She knew her story was not unique. Thousands of other Black men and women face similar experiences every day, but she wasn't going to leave it at that. They won't break me, she told herself. I'll fight like I always have. When Allison finally made it to the hospital, she was relieved, but the humiliation still stood before her eyes. She knew this episode would be part of her story, but it would not define it. As she entered her grandson's room, she smiled, hiding her worries. "Grandma's here, my boy," she said. Her voice was warm, but there was determination in her eyes. She realized that her struggle was just beginning, and she was ready to continue. After the humiliating stop, Allison thought the worst was over. But she was wrong. The policeman who had detained her handcuffed her without explanation, saying, "You're coming with us." Her hands were numb from the rough steel shackles, and words of outrage stuck in her throat. She couldn't believe such injustice was still possible. She was taken to the local station, where the cold stares of those around her made every second a torture. She was led into a cell, narrow with a metal bed and bench. The cell seemed like a closed world where all the senses were multiplied. Allison sat down on the bench, leaning her back against the cold wall, and tried to collect her thoughts. "Why?" she whispered, lowering her head. The policemen seemed to enjoy their power. One of them stepped up to the bars, tossing through the bars. "Get used to it, lady. This is where you belong." Allison raised her head, her gaze hard. "My place is with my family." "You're wrong." He grinned and walked away, but resentment boiled inside Allison. She remembered the lessons her father had taught her to maintain her dignity, even in her darkest moments. "Don't let them break you," he used to say when she was little. Her thoughts returned to her family. Anna, Michael, her grandchildren. She knew she had to stand up for them. The new day had barely begun when she was taken out of the cell for interrogation. At the table sat a young officer whose eyes expressed slight regret. He placed some papers in front of her. "Sign this and we can negotiate," he said. Allison leaned closer to read the document. It was a plea agreement. "I didn't do anything," she answered firmly, raising her head. "Lady, it will make your life easier," the officer insisted. "So? You want me to admit something I didn't do?" "That's not relief. It's a lie," she replied. The man froze for a second, then shrugged and gestured for her to return to her cell. Once back in the cell, Allison felt her strength leaving her. She sat down on the bench, dropping her head on her hands. She knew her family would soon find out what had happened, and it hurt. "Lord, give me strength," she whispered, closing her eyes. She remembered the moments when her life had seemed even harder: the march in Selma, George's death, the fight for children's rights. All these trials had not broken her. She knew that if she survived them, she would survive this night. In the early morning, Allison was awakened by footsteps. She heard a voice that made her jump up from her seat. "My mother is here. I demand her release." It was Michael, her son. His voice was firm, even a little menacing. In the cell, Allison's heart filled with pride and relief. "Your bail is paid," one of the officers said as he opened the cell door. She was led out to Michael. When he saw her, he rushed to her and hugged her tightly. "Mom, that was the last time anyone would ever do that to you," he said. Allison clung to his shoulder, holding back tears. "Thank you, son. But we're not done yet." On his way out of the station, Michael held Allison's hand. He was visibly agitated. "Mom, we're going to fight this. I've already contacted a lawyer." Allison stopped and looked him in the eye. "We'll fight, Michael, but not for revenge, for the sake of making sure that no one else has to go through this." Michael nodded. His eyes glistened with emotion, but there was determination in them. "They have no right to do that to you, Mom," he said firmly. Allison smiled. "You're my son, and I know you'll get justice." Returning home was both a relief and a new challenge for Allison. She knew that this night behind bars was not just an accident, but part of a systemic injustice. Michael helped her into the house and sat her down on the couch. "Get some rest, Mom. Now it's my turn to fight," he said. But Allison knew her fight wasn't over. She couldn't just stay on the sidelines. This night had shown her that the fight for equality was still relevant. She looked at her son and said, "Together, Michael. We're going to do this together." And in that moment, Allison realized that her fight for justice had a new lease on life. She was no longer alone. Her family was with her, and that gave her the strength to continue. That night was a turning point for Allison and her family. Instead of breaking them, it strengthened their resolve to fight for a better future. Courts, public appearances, and possibly new trials lay ahead of them. But Allison knew they would make it through. Allison felt a new strength in herself after being released from her overnight confinement. She knew that the events that had transpired over the past few days were only the tip of the iceberg. The fight for justice was not only a personal cause, but a fight for everyone who faced systemic racism in this city. Allison realized that it was her duty to not just stand up for herself, but to protect others as well. Together with Michael and other family members, they decided to start a legal battle against police brutality. To do so, they needed evidence, facts, and witnesses. But against them stood a powerful system that protected its representatives at all costs. Allison went to the house where the surveillance camera from one neighboring house had been left. She knew the footage could be key evidence against the police officer who had stopped and humiliated her. "There should be a video here, Mom," Michael said, studying the files on his phone. Scrolling through the footage, they found footage that showed the officer walking up to Allison's car, pulling out a gun and pointing it at her. That footage was clear and undeniable. "That will be our first argument in court," Michael said firmly. The problem, however, was that the local police controlled many aspects of life in Birmingham, including the judicial system. The local authorities were prepared to protect their officers at all costs. When they requested reports from the local police department, Michael discovered something shocking. There were errors and inconsistencies in the official report of her arrest. The police officer who arrested her claimed that Allison was violent and breaking the law, even though the video clearly showed that he was the one who initiated the whole thing. "They're trying to hide the truth," Michael commented, studying the reports. "But we're not going to let that happen." Allison realized that it would become critical for them to find witnesses who could confirm her innocence. Allison and Michael set off through the streets of Birmingham, talking to neighbors and passers-by. They found a woman named Sarah Johnson who had seen Allison being pulled over. Sarah said she heard loud yelling and saw a police officer pointing a gun at Allison. "I just can't keep quiet anymore," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "I'm ready to say everything in court." They also managed to find James Taylor, a former human rights activist who had attended many marches and who had long fought against injustice in Birmingham. James agreed to become their lawyer and represent them in court. Meanwhile, local authorities and police began to put pressure on the Allison family. Uninvited guests entered their home several times and left strange markings on the walls. On one occasion, Michael was threatened in a dark alley as he was returning home. "If you continue your fight, the last thing you will see will be the death of your mother," the stranger said, hiding his face in the shadows. Michael realized that the situation was getting more and more dangerous. However, he refused to back down. "We will not let them break us," he said, turning to his mother and other family members. "We have to keep going." Allison sensed that these threats were more than just words. She knew that their fight could have been a real war for survival and justice. Together with James Taylor, they began to build a defense. The lawyer accepted their case without question and began to analyze the evidence gathered. He began drafting legal documents, preparing them for trial. "We'll use everything: video footage, witness statements, reports, even social media posts," James said, clenching his fist hard. Allison worked day and night, verifying every fact in detail. She wrote letters to various human rights organizations and sought support from local and national media. The Brooks family joined with other local activist groups. They organized rallies and demonstrations to draw public attention to their struggle. Participants in the marches held signs that read, "Justice for Allison Brooks. Зрение. Нет расизма в нашей городе. И другие." Allison felt the support of the community. People of different ages and races were out on the streets, uniting for one goal. It gave her the strength to keep fighting. One day, when Michael was returning home from a meeting with James, he found their car completely trashed in the garage. This was the final step in their ordeal, which showed that the police and local authorities would stop at nothing. "They may break my car, but they won't break my soul," Michael said, looking at the damaged car. Allison approached him, her eyes burning with determination. "We can do this, together. And the truth will win," she replied. This chapter of their struggle showed that their journey was not only a fight for personal honor, but also a symbol of fighting for the rights of all those who face discrimination and systemic racism. Allison knew they were in a real battle, but she and Michael had confidence that justice would ultimately prevail. A sunny morning spread shadows across the facade of the courthouse in Birmingham. Local residents, activists, and journalists filled the streets around the building, holding placards and banners. People's faces expressed determination and hope, but there was a special heaviness in Allison's eyes. Today was her day, the day she was supposed to tell her story to the world and get justice. Michael stood beside her, holding a file folder in his hand. James Taylor, their attorney, was scrutinizing the latest records and reports. The atmosphere was tense, but the energy in their eyes was unyielding. "We're not just here for ourselves, but for everyone who has suffered under this system," James said, looking at the Brooks family. Allison nodded. She felt that this day would not just be a personal battle, but a symbolic fight for equality and justice for the entire city. The sound of the judge's gavel echoed through the hall, and all present stood up. Judge Williams, an older man, but clear-eyed, entered the room. He studied the people present and looked briefly at Allison. "Let's begin the hearing in the case of Allison Brooks versus Officer David Harris," the judge announced. The defendant's attorney, Mr. James Peterson, stood up. He was an arrogant man with a smirk and an impeccable suit. His job was to cast doubt on everything the Brooks family had gathered in evidence. "Your Honor, I have no doubt about my client's integrity. Officer Harris was performing his duties in accordance with the law, protecting public order," he stated. Allison felt her heart beat faster. She knew that every step she took in this room would make a difference. James Taylor was the first to speak. He outlined all the evidence collected: video footage from the camera of the neighboring house, witness testimonies, expert reports. But he also talked about the human side of this struggle. Allison Brooks is not just a victim. She is a woman, a mother and grandmother, a person who has fought for justice and equality her entire life. She is not a criminal. She is a symbol of all who endure injustice and racial discrimination, James said. There was silence in the courtroom. Many of the listeners felt his words penetrating their hearts. When it was her time to speak, Allison stood up. She walked to the podium and made eye contact with the judge, the lawyers, and those present. "I was born in Alabama, in a world where skin color meant who you were and what destiny you might have," Allison began, her voice strong and clear. "But I've always known that dignity and respect don't depend on the color of your skin. They depend on who you are and what you do." She was silent for a second, gathering her thoughts. "The day I was pulled over by Officer Harris, I stood before him not just as Allison Brooks, but as the voice of millions of people who face injustice every day. I was humiliated and scared, but I had not lost my power. I did not lose my faith that justice exists and will prevail." Allison talked about her father, who taught her how to fight for her rights and maintain her dignity, even in the toughest situations. She talked about her family and how Michael always stood by her side and supported her. "I'm not asking you to just believe me. I am asking you to see the facts, see the truth, and make the right choice. Justice should be for everyone, not just those in power." Her eyes were full of tears, but her voice remained firm. David Harris's attorney stood up and started asking questions. He tried to crack her belief in the truth by reminding her that she may have been aggressive or misbehaved. "Allison, you argue that Officer Harris broke the law. But what do you say about the order and responsibility he was protecting?" he asked. Allison replied calmly, "Order and law are not just words. They mean protection, equality, and justice. But order must not jeopardize the life of an innocent person, and the law must not be biased. I am not here to destroy order, but to make it just." After several hours of discussion and responses, Judge Williams adjourned. He retired to his residence to consider the arguments and evidence. When he returned to the courtroom, his eyes met Allison's. He said, "We accept the evidence of the Brooks family and defer judgment for further consideration. The truth must not remain in the shadows." Allison's family and supporters cheered at the news. It was an important step toward victory. They were greeted outside by activists and locals who had come to support Allison. She stood there among her family, surrounded by friends and supporters. People applauded, some crying tears of joy. "We did it together." Michael hugged his mother. Allison knew they had challenges ahead of them and a long road to victory, but her inner fire was even brighter. She realized that their battle was not only for themselves, but for the future of everyone who strives for equality and justice. She raised her hand in victory. We will win because the truth is on our side. Allison Brooks wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for a future where everyone would be judged by their actions, not the color of their skin. The elephantine silence in the courtroom was broken by the sound of the judge's gavel. Allison sat in the front row, her hands clutching Michael's finger tightly. Judge Williams announced a verdict that was historic for Birmingham. Officer David Harris is immediately dismissed from the police force and must stand trial for his actions against Allison Brooks. The judge spoke, his voice sounding confident, but it was clear he was feeling the weight of responsibility. Allison felt the lump in her throat gradually dissolve. She couldn't believe that justice had been served, at least in this case. She dropped her head onto Michael's shoulder, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We did it, Mom," he hugged her. "This is just the beginning. But we won today." But her soul was a mixed bag of feelings. Joy for the victory, but bitterness at the fact that it was just one incident in an endless struggle for rights and equality. Allison knew that this was not the end, but the beginning of a much more difficult journey. News of the court's decision spread quickly throughout Birmingham. The local community of activists, neighbors, and ordinary residents staged a massive demonstration downtown. People carried banners that read, "Justice for Allison," "Equality for all," and "We won, but we keep fighting." Allison stepped to the podium, her voice trembling with emotion. "We proved that the truth can win. But this is just the beginning. We must keep fighting until every person in our city, in our country, is judged by their actions, not by the color of their skin." She felt amazing support. Women, men, children of different races standing side by side in unity. Together they dreamed of a future where justice would be the norm. However, not everyone shared their joy. There were those who continued to defend Officer Harris and express their outrage. In the evening, a small rally of police supporters appeared outside Allison's home. They shouted, flashed placards, and displayed aggression. "Allison, you're a disgrace to the town," shouted one of the men in a leather jacket. Allison stood at the door of her house, her gaze hard and unyielding. "I am not a disgrace. I'm proud of what I do, and I'm proud of my family and community," she replied. She knew her words could not change the beliefs of those who stood against her, but she felt the need to be heard. After the demonstration, Allison returned home and had a small family reunion. The children gathered around her, their eyes shining with excitement and pride. "Mommy, we won!" exclaimed her grandson Jamal. "This is only the first step, my dears," Allison replied. "Victory is good, but our work is just beginning. We must continue to protect people's rights, help those in need, and teach that justice should be for all." But despite this realization, Allison felt relieved. She was no longer a victim of only her personal story. She had become a symbol of the struggle for equality and justice for all. Despite the court decision, the pressure did not disappear. At the local police station, other employees began to be scrutinized. Many of them suspected that their work could be scrutinized at any time. However, some remained loyal to the old ways and expressed their dissatisfaction with the new justice they had to work under. "If we can't protect order, then who are we?" asked one of the policemen, his voice expressing frustration and rage. Allison felt that the local police could still be an adversary in their fight. There were those within the community who saw the court's decision as a threat to stability. Some white residents of Birmingham believed that maintaining the existing order was more important than any change. "We must maintain calm and order, even if it means sacrificing some principles," they said in discussions. Allison fought not only for justice, but also to convince people that change was possible and needed to be embraced. Allison began working with James Taylor and other activists on plans to create training and support programs for the community. They organized workshops on human rights, talked about how to defend themselves in legal situations, and showed how cooperation could benefit everyone. She knew their mission went beyond a single court case. They were building a support network for all victims of racial discrimination, helping anyone who faced injustice. Although the trial was an important victory, Allison realized it was only the beginning. She was prepared for the fight for justice to be long and difficult. "We have to stay strong and keep telling the truth," she repeated over and over, looking into Michael and James's eyes. She knew that their actions in Birmingham would be part of a larger movement for human rights and equality across the country, of the entire community, showing that justice is not just a word, but a principle to be fought for every day. She continued to dream of a world where everyone has the right to equality, respect, and justice. When news of the court's ruling in her favor spread across the country, Allison Brooks suddenly became a public figure. She was no longer just a mother and grandmother, a victim and a fighter for her rights. She became a symbol of the fight for equality and justice for all. A photo of Allison on the day of the trial, where she stood with her hand raised in victory, graced the covers of leading magazines and news outlets across the country. Her face was not only a symbol of her personal struggle, but also a symbol of the struggle of millions of others who faced racial discrimination and prejudice. Shortly after the trial, Allison wrote a book called A Voice in the Silence. In it, she detailed her journey, her life in Alabama, her struggles in Birmingham, the injustices she endured, and her determination not to give up. She described encounters with police, demonstrations, and the inner strength she found in the most difficult situations. The book became a bestseller and inspired people across the country. Allison wrote in the foreword, "My voice is the voice of millions who have fought and continue to fight for equality and justice. If I can be a voice for change, then each of you can be a force for change in your community." Allison began appearing regularly on television. She appeared on talk shows and news programs to discuss issues of racial discrimination, social inequality, and human rights. Show hosts and television journalists invited her to discuss her personal experiences, her perspective, and her ideas about justice. One day she was invited to appear on a national show called Voice of America. The studio was filled with young people from around the country, journalists, and then leaders of community organizations. "Systemic injustice is not just Allison Brooks' story. It's the story of many of us," she said on the air, her voice sounding confident and emotional. "We must stop being victims and start taking action. Justice is not just a word, it is a promise that we must fulfill together." Her words inspired people not only in the studio, but outside the studio as well. Social media was flooded with comments and messages from young and old, white and dark-skinned people who said, "Thank you, Allison. You've given me the strength to fight. We're together, and the truth will win." Allison knew that her personal experience was just the tip of the iceberg. She began holding meetings in different cities where she met other people who had experienced injustice. She met Lucy Ford in Chicago, a woman who lost her job because of racial bias. Lucy told Allison how she had to work in an environment where her racist coworkers made her life unbearable. Allison sat next to her in the small coffee shop and listened to her story, her eyes filling with tears. "We'll fight together, Lucy. You are not alone. I promise you that we'll do anything to change that," Allison said, holding Lucy's hand in hers. Another encounter was talking to Mark Simmons in Philadelphia, a young guy who was arrested simply for waiting for the bus. Mark was forced to pay huge fines and was a victim of bias in the justice system. Allison organized Mark to meet with other activists and lawyers. She helped him find lawyers and document his story to tell the world. These encounters were not only personal, but also political. Allison used their stories to create social media campaigns and programs, collected signatures for a petition, and organized demonstrations. Allison founded an organization called Voice of Justice, which became a platform for anyone who wanted to fight for rights and equality. The organization provided legal aid, training, information materials, and organized rallies and demonstrations. She has developed programs for young people, teaching them activism and how to protect their rights in their daily lives. We must give people the power to know that their voice matters. Every person matters, and together we can make our world a fairer and more equal place, Allison said at every rally. Despite all her successes, Allison was still the same woman who as a child had seen buses with whites-only seats. She still felt the pain and challenges, but now that pain was part of her mission. She communicated more frequently with Michael and James, discussing the organization's plans and debating how best to help the community. James became her staunch ally, organizing meetings and finding people willing to join the movement. Michael, on the other hand, started his own project to create programs for teenagers where they could discuss social problems and find solutions. Allison knew her mission was longer and more complex than just winning one lawsuit. She fought for change in the country, for justice to be the foundation of society, not the exception. Allison Brooks became not only a symbol of struggle, but also a leader of the movement. She not only told the stories of others, but also inspired people to fight for their rights, to step forward confidently despite fears and difficulties. There was a fire in her eyes that could not be extinguished. She knew that their victories and trials were part of a greater journey, a journey where every voice mattered and where millions of people fighting for justice could be part of the change. Allison was certain that their fight would not end until every person in the country was judged not by the color of their skin, but by their character and actions. At the age of 80, Allison Brooks remained a living symbol of the struggle for equality and justice. She remained active in the movement despite her age and physical frailty. Brooks's home became a local center for discussion and organizing projects. Allison welcomed activists, young people, representatives of local organizations, and even those who had once been her opponents. Every evening, she sat in her old armchair in the living room, looking at the photographs on the walls. These pictures reminded her of key moments in her life: protests in Birmingham, court hearings, television appearances, and meetings with other victims of discrimination. But most of all, she loved looking at her children and grandchildren. She told them, "We must not only dream of justice, but also create it. Justice is not just words, it is what we do every day." Michael, Allison's eldest son, became an important successor to her cause. He created the Voice of Justice and Equality Foundation, which provided assistance to those who faced racial discrimination. The foundation supported youth, provided scholarships, educational programs, and legal aid. The foundation has become a local and national platform, bringing together activists, academics, young people, and opinion leaders. Michael has often said in interviews, "My mom fought for all of us. She taught us that change is possible, and now we must continue her work, creating a future where everyone has the right to equality and respect." Michael has brought attention to social issues in cities across the country, collaborating with other foundations and social movement leaders. He personally organized meetings in schools to discuss racial discrimination and social responsibility, held workshops for teenagers, and counseled families facing injustice. Allison's grandchildren were the ones who breathed new life into her dream of equality. Jamal, the eldest grandson, attended Harvard University and was active in student initiatives. He organized a campaign to defend the rights of Black students at universities and schools, fighting against bias and discrimination. Lisa, Michael's daughter, led a project to improve living conditions in Birmingham's poorest neighborhoods. She organized free education and programming courses for children, giving them the tools for a successful future. The youngest grandson was James, who joined Voice of the Future, a youth initiative aimed at getting young people involved in activism and social projects. He organized meetings and trainings for teenagers, inspiring them to become part of the change. These grandchildren didn't just carry on Allison's work, they turned her dreams into reality. They built schools, rebuilt communities, and fought for equality in every part of the country. Allison has been honored with numerous awards for her contributions to the fight for human rights and equality. Schools and parks in Birmingham have been named after her, and her portraits have hung in city halls and educational institutions. But Allison never sought recognition. She continued to teach her family and community that real victory lies in the change you create around you. When she was on the verge of her passing at age 85, Allison told Michael, "Son, remember that justice is not just a struggle. It is how you live your life every day. You must teach your children and others that respect, love, and justice are the foundation on which our society stands." These words were the last instructions from a mother to her son and grandchildren. On the day of Allison Brooks' funeral, thousands of people came to say goodbye. Communities, activists, and leaders stood in a long neck in tribute to a woman who dedicated her life to fighting for equality. On Allison's grave was a simple stone with an inscription: "Allison Brooks' voice will continue in everyone who fights for justice and equality." Around them were grandchildren and son Michael, holding flags and placards symbolizing their mission. They pledged to continue to fight and defend those who face discrimination. Allison Brooks left the world behind, but her legacy lived on in every corner of the country. In every schoolyard, every youth program, and every performance by Michael and Jamal, her voice was heard. She was a symbol that change is possible if you fight for it, not only with words, but also with actions. Allison showed that everyone can be a voice for justice and equality. Her dream of justice for all did not die. It grew in the hearts of those who carried on her work, in educational initiatives, in community projects, and in every person who chose to stand up for truth and equality, no matter what. Allison Brooks was not just a part of history, but a maker of it. Her legacy is not just victories in the courts and demonstrations, but her daily actions to make the world a place where everyone, regardless of color, is entitled to respect, opportunity, and justice. Thank you for your attention and for letting this story be a part of your day. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. See you again.